President Eisenhower's militant call for a grand plan to provide a modern controlled access highway system for safe, efficient transcontinental travel led to the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. He dramatically underscored the fact that our interstate road network is inadequate locally and obsolete nationally.
Begun in 1956, the interstate highway system was originally planned to be completed by 1972. However, like many transportation projects, it was over time and over budget. By 1972, only 70% of the system was complete. Furthermore, the cost had far exceeded the original estimate of $27 billion. By the time Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the system was 95% complete, but the cost of the final 2,000 miles was estimated to be almost $50 billion. President Reagan, who was opposed to tax increases, proposed letting the system remain uncompleted rather than raise the gas tax. However, after Republicans suffered heavy losses in the 1982 midterm elections due to a recession, Reagan agreed to a 5-cent per gallon increase in the gas tax, permitting construction to continue. The tax was raised again in 1990 and 1994. The system was finally completed in 1991, 19 years behind schedule. The original federal share had been estimated to be $27 billion. Ultimately, it was $130 billion, almost 5 times greater. The federal government paid for 90% of the construction costs, with the states picking up the other 10%. However, all this freeway construction led to the rise of several new issues. Concerns over urban sprawl led to the freeway revolt of the 1960s. Activists argued that highway construction led to low population densities and long commutes, as people fled cities for the suburbs. This had wide-ranging and negative environmental impacts, from increased air pollution to the loss of natural spaces. In addition, the emerging environmental justice movement noted that these impacts tended to disproportionately affect minority communities. Interstate highway projects in several major cities ran through and destroyed historical African American neighborhoods. Atlanta was just one major example. There, the historic Mechanicsville and Somerville neighborhoods were demolished, and the interstate highway itself served as a physical barrier between the remaining black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. Those decisions affect traffic and race relations in Atlanta and other cities to this day. To make matters worse, although increased highway construction had been promised to relieve congestion, the exact opposite happened, as more and more cars flooded the roads. These problems led to several important pieces of federal legislation to address them. First, interest in public funding and constructing of mass transit systems increased. Before the 1960s, mass transit was controlled almost exclusively by private businesses in most parts of the country. But, as a result of lobbying by the National Mayors Association, Congress approved $25 million in grants and $50 million in loans for mass transit in an otherwise unrelated housing bill in 1961, representing the first federal investment in mass transit. This investment was significantly increased and made more permanent by the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which gave states $375 million over 3 years to pay for up to 2/3 of the cost of planning, building, and maintaining mass transit systems. In addition, the Highway Act of 1962 made significant changes to highway operation procedures, which now required more planning and coordination between various government agencies representing different levels of government and different modes of transportation. For example, the law required that metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, representing all local governments within a region, be involved in planning for all major highway and transit projects in urban areas. Examples of MPOs in California include the Southern California Association of Governments in the LA Basin, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area. The hope was that greater coordination would lead to a more efficient transportation system. As a further part of this effort, Congress established the Department of Transportation as a cabinet agency in 1966, and it began operations in 1967. In addition, environmental concerns led to the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, or NEPA. NEPA required an analysis of the environmental impacts of all projects and receiving federal funds, including highways and mass transit projects. Projects with significant impacts were also required to consider alternative proposals. The following year, California passed its own environmental quality law, known as CEQA, which goes farther than federal law by actually mandating the adopting of all feasible measures to mitigate negative environmental impacts. Another development during this era was the deregulation movement. In the 1970s, liberals and conservatives joined forces to begin deregulating the airline industry, a task that was accomplished in 1978. They then moved to the rail and trucking industries. In 1980, the Motor Carrier Act deregulated the trucking industry, while the Staggers Rail Act deregulated the railroad industry. This meant that while some regulations were left in place, the ICC lost much of its authority over rate regulation and the regulation of routes and firms. And, in fact, the ICC, the nation's very first regulatory agency, was finally abolished in 1995, and its remaining functions turned over to the Surface Transportation Board. When the interstate highway system was finally completed in 1991, it gave the federal government an opportunity to reflect on these various changes, and to pursue a new approach to transit planning. The intermodal era had begun.